32 ticks following. So they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow 2 will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale Kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn?
Welcome to Ake Arts and Books Festival 2020 online. My name is Aisha Babalakin, and I will be hosting a book chat with Raven Leilani. Welcome, Raven.
Thank you for having me.
No, I'm so happy to have you. Have you ever visited Nigeria before?
I haven't, no.
You need to come, and you need to come to Ake. Very important.
I really do.
It's one of the best book festivals around. Have you, because I know your book came out in August in the States, and that was, in 2020, we've all been under lockdown. Have you enjoyed having a virtual book tour so far? Have there been any positives?
Oh, well, definitely. I mean, it's interesting because I'm a debut author, so I don't really have anything to measure it up against. This is what it looks like for me because this is my first time around. But it's kind of a nice, gentle on-ramp for a new person. I feel like slightly less stressed to be in a room full of people. At the same time, I feel like this medium, it's one in which you can kind of hop in, and it's almost as if you're kind of eavesdropping on a conversation between two people, which I really, really dig.
Yeah, and it probably means you get more opportunities like this one, which is a festival that happens in Nigeria.
That's right.
That you may not have been able to make ordinarily, but now you get to come.
That's right.
Well, the theme of Ake this year is African time. And I was wondering, does that mean anything to you when you hear that phrase?
African time?
Yes.
I mean, it's funny. The first thing that comes to my mind is CP time, which is what we say here when we're late. So I don't. That's sort of what I that was the first thing that came to my mind, and I'm not sure if that's what you mean. But I do think that I do think that here we're seeing a real kind of renaissance of Black writers, Black artists who are really just saying urgent and making urgent and beautiful work.
I agree. And I feel like, especially during COVID and quarantine and the summer that we've had, I feel like people are very aware of what time means to them.
Yes.
And how important it is to just, work as hard as you can in the time that you have. Even though everything feels like a time warp, some days you're like, what month is this?
Right, that's right.
Well, as a millennial, I know you identify as a millennial. Do you ever feel like time is slipping away from you?
I mean, yes. I would say that when we talk about millennial fiction, millennial art, what we're often talking about is instability and trying to find meaning in your work. And I feel like for me, I'll just speak personally, and that this part kind of made it into the book, which was that for most of my working life, it was sort of defined by trying to carve out time to do the private work that meant something to me while also making a living. And there was an element of that where I absolutely felt very aware of the way that time was finite. Because the time that I spent making the private, meaningful work, that was like a very kind of small and precious window.
And when did you feel the urge to combine those two different lives, like your private life where you were making the work that you loved, like you were writing, and your other life, which was the more corporate life?
It almost felt like that part wasn't up to me. I think I kind of did as much work as I could on my end. For I'd say 5 or 6 years. Like I started, I guess it's 7 now. I guess I stopped counting at some point. But when I was about 23, like that was when I really tried to start getting published. That's when I started really writing when I came home after work and trying to be serious about my craft. And it really took those years of me, going to work and then coming home and carving out time to write and submitting to literary journals and magazines and collecting the rejections that you collect and kind of that trial and error, and eventually moving into novel length work and making the kind of the choice to move to New York to pursue my MFA, like those years were spent really, I mean, because, you know, you have to make money and you have to like have money enough to you know, pay rent and student debt, that I kept a job, you know, because those were practical needs I had to support. And I had the other part of me on the side. You know, I was working on that kind of privately. And I think it really, those two things merged more when I kind of started to get some traction with this book.
Okay, with this book, which we're going to get
Yeah.
into right now. So this book is called Luster. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. I loved it so much. I've read it multiple times, even though it came out like a month or two ago. So it tells the story of Edie, who's a Black woman who enters into a relationship with Eric, an older white man who is in an open marriage with his wife, Rebecca. Now, when you read the jacket cover and you hear about this relationship, you think about the power dynamics. Like Edie is younger, she's a Black woman, she lives in like Bushwick, and then you have this like older couple living out in the suburbs, and you must think, oh, you know, the couple has all the power. But when I was reading it, it really felt a lot that like that Edie had all the cards.
Yeah.
Did you write that intentionally? Was that something you wanted to portray?
I mean, it was really important to me when I was writing Edie that she be a person that, you know, that I be rigorous and also candid about the ways that she is powerless in her, you know, within her kind of many environments. Not powerless exactly, but that there are structural impediments to the access she has to find steady work, to be able to produce her art. But at the same time, she is a Black woman with great agency. You know, that was really important to me, and especially sexually. You know, she is a person who, you know, makes many mistakes and is deeply fallible, but at least in the sort of carnal realm, she is a person who can assert what she wants, which is sort of a kind of has great friction between her more public facing self, which she has to have as a Black woman moving through the world, you know, the one that is sort of is more curated, as opposed to the private one where she is asserting what she wants. And I mean, in a way, I will say that writing her was wish fulfillment in a way, because she does exhibit a kind of agency that I don't think I even particularly enjoy. You know, I wouldn't, you know, take a train to Jersey and walk into my older lover's house. You know, I wouldn't do that. And I don't think I could, right? You know, the realities around how her body is imperiled, you know, we feel that as real people in a different way. And so to write a Black woman who can flout that, you know, that was really liberating.
The way you described her honestly reminded me of, you know, did you ever watch the TV show Girls?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So when Girls came out and the main character, Hannah, she would just do things that would leave me as a Black woman just thinking, how does she do that and why? And I feel like Edie sometimes, you know, makes decisions kind of the way Hannah does, like almost as if the world doesn't get to constrain her.
Yes. And I mean, that was, you know, I thought about that. I did think about, you know, those sort of, I don't know, technically, right? Those are predecessors because they're in the realm of what we talk about when we talk about an unruly or unlikable woman, which generally is shorthand for this is a woman who exhibits a range of humanity and who's allowed to kind of hold contradictions that are true and inherent to being human, and a woman who's fallible, a woman who's angry. And those women, when they exist, they tend to be white, right? And at least in the, you know, in TV and in books, though there are a few examples in books of non-white women who are allowed their rage and are allowed their complexity. But no, that was important to me, that there be a Black woman on the page who is not pristine, like who's angry and who is making a lot of mistakes, but mistakes that are informed by that are human responses, you know, informed by kind of brutality and hyperbole of her environment.
Yes, and I loved her relationship with Rebecca, who is Eric's wife. They meet at some point in the book, and again with the power dynamics there, it not only is Edie younger and more carefree, but she also seems to be a lot more street smart.
I do think that, kind of necessarily, like she has to be in a way. I just think that she is exposed to a different, really, truly a different level of surveillance, a different level of brutality. We kind of, much of the page space is spent watching her work, watching her try and kind of grapple with the question of survival. That we see her at her job in publishing, and we see her working for Postmates and trying to rise to the occasion or rise to the demands, that she would, necessarily have to fulfill to make any capital. But in the midst of that, she has to, she still has a Black body, while trying to do this thing, and so she has to, those rooms are different, that her body is imperiled in a different way. And it necessitates a kind of calculation and a kind of studiousness that is part being Black woman and part her as an artist. So her awareness or her street smarts, even though I would say that occasionally, she's doing a lot of really dangerous things.
Yeah, all of the Postmates. There are so many times. Another part of the danger is also there's an element of violence in her relationship with Eric.
Yeah.
That she introduces into the relationship, or at least encourages. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Edie, at such a young age, is ready to, play with power in that way?
When I try and describe this aspect of the book, I do admit that I have, off the cuff, some difficulty. I wanted to say that on that, one, it was really important that I represent a Black woman's desire in a kind of unvarnished and non-judgmental way, but also to show a character like Edie, who is, who has, this sort of pathologizes it in a way I don't mean, but who is, her body is subject to a kind of violence in the public realm, and she is technically, right, inviting it in the private realm. And I think that that friction, through that, is her embracing or taking control, seizing control of an inevitable thing in a way. That this is her way of asserting her control over a thing that she kind of, in most parts of her life, does not have any real control over. But also, I would say that there is, in her consciousness, in existing in the world, in the way that she has to, which is an existence that is hyper vigilant and constantly calculating, extremely active, as opposed to Eric, who kind of can relax in who he is and be authentic and be himself. Edie's being is active in the way that she's constantly, trying to figure out how to curate herself. That there's an element of that state of being that is, that is exhausting, but also hyper aware of the sort of different masks that you're wearing depending on where you are. And in leaning into this violence, it is, I think, absolutely a leaning into a surrender to a kind of annihilation, a relief, of for a moment, obliteration, as opposed to the super presence that she has to have at every moment to live. So there are so many kind of different angles to talk about it.
Yeah. I do love your use of the word masks there, because that's something that really resonates with me, just in kind of your work mask and your home mask and the mask you wear when you're on the subway. It's a shared experience that I think, most Black women living in a big city will be able to relate to. Did you often feel that way when you were working in the city, in publishing, feeling like you had to put on different masks?
I think in an ideal world, we would be able to relax in ourselves and kind of let down, like kind of be less vigilant. Because I do think that like that hypervigilance, it definitely kind of it wears away, you know, at the self, you know. And I absolutely, you know, there are those scenes that I wrote with Edie and Aria, you know, the friend, you know, the would-be friend at work who kind of has a different tack of survival, one that is hyper curated, one that makes, you know, one that defers to the fact of there being a very slim margin for error for Black women, you know. So, and absolutely, like in my real life, I feel and have felt extremely susceptible and vulnerable to that. You know, aware, no matter, you know, how well-meaning your audience, no matter if your audience is even kin, you know, that performance is survival. And it, I think we all kind of, you know, we learn that, you know. And even, you know, I would say with like my family, you know, that there was that moment where they, you know, they sat me down and we tried to break, you know, gently what the world or country I had would be, and that necessitated a kind of performance. So like it was early on, right, that I learned I would have to protect myself. I would have to perform, and I'm not, you know, I still feel that. Of course, I still feel that. Yeah.
Yeah, I really love the dynamic between Edie and Aria as well, and the conversation they have, I think, is something that describes a lot of people's own interactions in corporate world. Well, moving to another Black character in the book, Akila, who is the adopted child of Eric and Rebecca. And Akila is Black. And the first time Edie meets Akila, I know I, as a reader, immediately wanted to pick up Akila and just hold her and take her somewhere safe. So I guess my question to that is, you know, what went into creating Akila? What were you trying to, you know, depict there about, you know, Eric and Rebecca and, you know, their relationships with Black people?
Right. I mean, with Akila, I really wanted it more to be about her development as opposed to the way that like perhaps Eric and Rebecca are not, are kind of messing it up in a way, like messing it up in a way that two people who are of a totally different, maybe even opposed lived experience would, right? Like, so I tried to depict that in a way that wasn't judgmental, but also realistic about how they would handle, you know, child rearing when the demands are different, really quite different from their own lived experience. But with Akila, you know, I really, you know, she is like Edie, an isolated Black girl, and with her, you know, her kind of situation is different. She immediately, when Edie comes into the house, she's sensitive to the way that this is a threat to the stability that she is desperately trying to maintain, you know, and in a way, you know, it's sort of parallel to Edie's, you know, Edie's kind of situation where she also is seeking a kind of, you know, economic stability as well, an affirmation of personhood. But she's developing, she's a young and sort of mutable Black girl who's developing in an environment that can't adequately witness her. And so that development is complicated and is lonely. And I wanted to depict two Black women, you know, bringing those two characters together, Edie and Akila. That was a relief to me, even writing that on the page, to bring two Black women together and have them like relieve their kind of respective loneliness and isolation. And with Akila too, and I think, to be honest, like there is more of me in her than in any character in this book. You know, she is like also a Black geek, you know, and so like I wanted to depict what that looks like to kind of be seeking your people, be seeking, you know, a sort of recognition, you know, of your experience, but also be what young Black joy looks like, you know. And that was really important to me. You know, she's a fandom that's where I got to kind of shoehorn in like my fandom, my obsession with fandom. But there were two sides. One, I wanted to kind of sensitively depict what it looks like to kind of seek while you're trying to form your own identity, especially inform your idea of what Blackness is in an environment where you can't really look outward and see, examples, but also what it looks like when you're, young and Black and excited about something.
Well, I also think, being a young geek is also an isolating experience. Like I was, they got to take her to Comic-Con, which I had always dreamed of when I was younger. And I wonder, have you ever been to Comic-Con?
100%. And it's funny you say that, because you're right. You're really right. Like being a geek, like a real true blue geek, is a real kind of, it can be a lonely experience. You don't like have other people to kind of commune with. And I had moments like that until I found my geeks, and Akila has that too. But the flip side of that is when you find your people, when you find your fandom, it is it's a great communal joy, and that is the most important thing to me about fandom. So absolutely, I've been to Comic-Con. I've been a handful of times. I've dressed up a couple of times, but not every time. And it's just the first time I went, I was kind of in a weird moment in my life. I was like 19 or 18, something like that. And I had just left, or kind of stopped, I'd left my church, my faith. And so I was kind of like rootless in a different way. And the first time I went to Comic-Con, it literally did feel like a religious experience. It just felt like such recognition of my joy to be able to share it with people who felt it in that same fever pitch, is a really beautiful thing. And I think that artery kind of does run through this book, not even necessarily through fandom and like geekery. It is just, this is a book where people are seeking their people. They're seeking that recognition. They're wanting to be witnessed.
The relationship between Akila and Edie, they obviously are drawn to each other, perhaps because they're the only Black people, living in these suburbs, and because they live in the same house. But sometimes when you're reading scenes with both of them in it, or parts of the sections of the book with both of them in it, Edie can tell that she's being monitored by other people in the neighborhood. She can tell that she's being watched. Now, it almost feels like a horror movie in the style of like Get Out and some of the other horror movies we're seeing right now. In the wake of, the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, have people resonated more with those scenes than you expected?
Yes, definitely. I feel like since the book has come out, a lot of people have wanted to talk about that aspect of the book. And there's like an element of writing a book and releasing it out to the world. You can never know what climate you're going to release into. Though I will say, like, the climate that we're in now, where we're kind of constantly and trying to and asking for better and angry, I should say, and angry. That is actually, I would say that climate has been ongoing. I think something has changed now. It does. I've asked older people in my family because I wanted to feel optimistic. I really have missed that feeling, and so I called up my family just to see, because they've been through so much more, and honestly through so much worse. And so I called them. I was like, does it feel like the tide is turning, or is it just me? And my elders have said that they do feel like something is changing. So in that way, it is different, in that the response and what I think a lot of people are beginning to see. I mean, it's a shame that we have to have like video evidence, and you don't necessarily want, having created a thing that is meant to replicate the consciousness of a Black woman, which then includes surveillance and violence and racism, that's relevant to her existence. But you don't necessarily want that art to resonate like that. You want the moment to be a memory. I hope at some point that we can get there. I do, I am really grateful that, and with hoping that I kind of depicted it in a way that felt, that felt sensitive. I'm happy that we are engaging in these conversations now. That I do, you want to write, you don't want to write about sort of brutality of racism and have it always be a tiny thing, right? You want it to be a thing that is at least beginning to be over, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I mean, I was happy that you in your story, like, yes, there were scenes of brutality and even microaggressions, but there was also so much joy and frustration and millennial anxiety. I personally tend to prefer to read books and film and watch films that don't center Black trauma as much. And your book was kind of just a great reprieve.
Thank you.
For me.
I really appreciate that.
I want to talk about Edie as an artist, because the book really is about her journey, like being an artist, or would you say becoming an artist or just being an artist? What would you say is Edie's journey?
I would say it's tricky, because I think that if you're practicing the craft, then you are that. So she is an artist, but she also is becoming. And because I also think that no matter what craft you have, you are constantly moving forward. You're constantly becoming. So I think still though, she's becoming. And I actually see, like, behind you, there's that Amy Sherald.
Yeah.
Mama, I love that.
I love this. A friend gifted it to me a while ago, and this is where I work now because of coronavirus. And so if people zoom into me, I can look back and be like, Michelle's protecting me.
I love it. I mean, just as an aside, I went and I saw her exhibit, like, in the before time, and it was just like, I remember that day. It was such joy. It was such joy to go and kind of see these big, beautiful portraits, of Black people. And specifically, Amy Sherald is, like, incredible with rendering textured hair, which I think is the hardest thing. But more to the point, and I guess that's part of it. It's like the joy of a reality in a way that kind of affirms your own reality and hopefully makes other people feel less alone and affirmed. Art was important to me in this, partly because it was the first, the painting was the first thing I ever really loved. And I wanted to depict that's one of her, even though it's kind of like both despair and joy, but that is also her joy. The moment, like, you have any project, writing or painting or anything that you make, the sort of the despair of grappling with your limits, but the joy of breaking through. In this case, in depicting a young Black woman who is trying to make art, the despair is partially structural. Like, it's partially a part of how her environment kind of impedes access to time, to art, to psychic energy. But I did ultimately want to show a Black woman, being able to generate, making it to a place where she can put herself down on a canvas.
I like also the way you describe her painting and her frustration when she doesn't get it right, or if she doesn't like the painting, as just kind of part of the process. I mean,
Yes.
that sometimes you can really love something but not be good at it, or working on it.
Truly important in depicting any kind of art making process to make room to talk about failure, which seems like a downer, to talk about, but is really, I think, is the reality of the thing. And in the way that in order to make anything, I think you constantly have to grapple with your limits about how good you are at the thing. And even though that's, like, relatively subjective, but, like, that is so much a part of the process, and it has been for me in terms of writing. I would say, like, 89% of it was really me sending out drafts and getting rejections, or sending out, like, drafts and then kind of pulling it back and trying to revise and figure out what would work, and years of kind of just, like, tweaking and working on my craft and feeling that self-doubt and wallowing it a little bit, and then kind of coming back to it. And I hope that in depicting, the role of failure in getting there, that would feel liberating.
Well, I think a lot of people also think of creative success as something innate. And I
Right.
think, it's important to depict the hill that you have to climb in order to get to what you really want. Do you feel, because we've been kept in our homes for so long this year, do you feel that you've been able to tap into that creative aspect of your life more? Have you been painting more, or?
I have been painting more. I actually feel like the painting side of my brain has turned on, and like the writing side is kind of turned off, I should say. But I think you're really right about that, about this idea that like that it's talent, that it's something that's innate, and in some cases, maybe, but I think that's a very, very small percent. I think ultimately it's work. It's real, dogged work, and I could say too that it's not equal across the board. In this book specifically, Edie is a person, because of her, many of her kind of the variables involved in her life. The time she doesn't have time to put in the work, right? She doesn't have the psychic bandwidth to put in the work, and so even work too is subject to a kind of privilege, the ability to do the work. But I did too want to talk about that. Like I kind of firmly believe that in most cases it's not a thing of it has to be something you're born with or something that's inherent. It's work. It's work and being willing to kind of mess up and do new work.
I mean, you have a good point there, because if you pluck Edie out of Bushwick and the tri-state area, put her in the south of France at some villa and just give her all her tools and you just say paint, you don't know what she's going to come out with, but she'll really put that work in. The problem is she doesn't have the time or the mental space.
That's right. And like that's actually sort of encapsulated in the fact that like, and I don't know if I'm like allowed to kind of, but half the book is in New York and half the book is in Jersey. And when she is sort of removed from the like initial situation, which she is kind of being battered by like the demands of living and trying to meet them and kind of failing. When you remove from that situation, you put her in the second half of the book, she actually has more time to grapple with her craft. In writing the book, that was really important to me, to have a very real and candid depiction about what, honestly, how privilege works around being able to make art.
So Edie, I know, she's the narrator of the book, and she often just walks around, she's observing everything around her. And her narrative voice is hilarious to me. I love it so much. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to read a section from page 9 of your book.
Of course, there is the business of trying to look sexy while hurtling across the sky. Like most white people who eat beans in the woods, undeterred by the fresh fecal evidence of hungry bears, Eric finds his mortality and soft, meaty body a petty, incidental thing. I, on the other hand, am acutely aware of all the ways I might die.
She's just so like morbid a little bit, but hilarious. And I wanted to know, do these thoughts just run through your head all day? Because she has so many like just very small observations about life that are so funny. How, yeah, what were your influences for writing the character? Was it all you, or?
I didn't, when I started out writing this book, I didn't intend for it to have as many jokes as it did. It really, there's an element of this where it really just started, it just came out. But I do think that, I do gravitate toward dark humor, to like gallows humor. And I think ultimately that's fitting for a character like Edie, who is trying to make her way toward her art, toward her personhood, through these extremely brutal and hyperbolic impediments, that she has sort of no control over. There's a certain amount of resignation, in her way of being that is, partly due to the fact that she has to inhabit a certain kind of stoicism to survive. So it's that stoicism up against, the brutality of her reality, which is where like the humor kind of was, and her rage, the sort of rage that we are privy to, because it's the first person. We can see the sort of the candid thoughts, internal dialogue up against her external performance. And that friction too is destabilizing, and also where the humor comes from. Because we're almost like privy to a secret. We kind of see what she thinks, which is often not what she says or how she behaves. And the sort of part of the comedy that's hyper observational, I think is owed to her Blackness. Really, because of the way that you have to be studious to move safely through the world. And that is maybe that's a really pessimistic thing to say, but like, I do think that there is an element of her being a Black woman. So, those two things together matter, of having to be self-protective and so having to be vigilant. So she is hyper observational. And also she's an artist. So that also feeds into it. And so that's, I think, where that comedy comes from. And also naturally, I guess, comes from me, having had to do, kind of comport myself in that way too, to also live.
Well, it's funny because recently a friend of mine asked me, she was like, "Oh, who are your favorite comedians, or who are your comedic inspirations?" And I remember I listed Destiny's Child as one of them, and Megan Thee Stallion. And I think that's like the Black woman like comedic factor. Like, there's certain songs of Destiny's Child that aren't really meant to be funny, but they're hilarious just because of delivery and what they're saying.
If you have a song that you think is hilarious, but is it Bills, Bills, Bills?
Bills, 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 and Bugaboo. Bugaboo is hilarious to me.
I was going to say Bugaboo first. That's great.
And sort of, I don't think they intend it to be funny, but I think Cater to You is also really funny.
Yes.
But yeah, I think navigating through the world as a Black woman, you need to have your wits about you, and also that shows in Edie as a character and as an artist. I wanted to talk to you a bit about your editing process, because there's going to be, hopefully a lot of young writers kind of listening to this chat and reading your book. So I first wanted to ask you, what kind of books influenced Luster? Like, what were you reading at the time, or what authors do you think inspired you?
Sure. I really, really love Britt Bennett's The Mothers. I think that it's brilliant. I really love Otessa Moshfegh's Homesick for Another World collection. I really loved Mary Gate's Bad Behavior. Susan Choi's My Education, which is like just really sexy and really beautifully rendered. I really love Zadie Smith. She's a genius, Return to White Teeth. When I need fuel to write, what I need to turn to is writing that I like, that makes me feel jealous. Basically, writing that makes me want to like reach, and kind of push a little harder, and that is generally also like more literally really beautiful on the page. Beauty that also has substance and heart. Because I think that some of the things I wrote when I was younger had beauty and no substance. I think it's not a rare thing to be a writer and be obsessed with the texture and feel of words. But at a certain point, I realized that there was nothing else there. I was having fun, but there's nothing else there. So my process more is about how do I tell a story that feels real, that feels urgent, in a way that feels good, in a way that allows me to exhibit my joy on the page. In terms of revision, I wrote this this first draft I wrote while I was working full time, and I was in school full time, and so I wrote it after the 9 to 5 at night. I'd bang out pages on the weekends. Just didn't go out at all. I kind of stayed inside, and I write at home. I didn't write anywhere else.
Okay.
And I just kind of slowly got it together. And it's a short book, but it took me a little over a year, in the last year of my MFA, and revising it. I will say, like, I'm incapable of getting a dirty draft down. I mean, ultimately, I ended up, you go through and you throw things out. But when I write, I am a slow writer, because if something feels wrong, I cannot move on. It has to feel like that what I put down is going to be the final thing. even though, you know, you come back a week later and you change it. But every line I'm obsessed with getting exactly right the first time I put it down. And so I'm very slow. Like a day of writing for me, a good day, I get 2 good paragraphs. And when I was revising with my editor, that was pretty fast for him too. But we revised over a summer together, and really tightened it up and polished it. But yeah, that was sort of a revision process.
So you're definitely someone who needs to edit as you write. Like you don't just like write 10 pages and then come back later.
Yes.
Okay. I'm the opposite. I have to write everything down and then think about it and then come back and then change the whole thing.
I love that. I actually admire that. I kind of wish that I that I wrote like that, to be honest.
It's just, yeah, for me, it's never right the first time ever. I usually 5 drafts is my minimum. This is the minimum I set for myself, and I just have to keep going back and back and back. You mentioned that you wrote this, you know, during the second half of your MFA at NYU, right? How did pursuing the MFA contribute to the book? You know, I know there's going to be people listening who maybe are considering an MFA, you know, thinking, weighing up the pros and cons. And I wanted to know more about what that was like, you know, going to school, learning from acclaimed writers, and then going back home to write.
Totally. And you know, like I think this like the MFA conversation is kind of fraught sometimes. And for me, I will say, like, I was living in DC. I was there for like 5 years before I came back to New York. It was really truly those entire 5 years, or maybe 4 of them, I was waffling. I was back and forth about should I do this, should I not? Because it was a really, really significant financial decision for me. Like uprooting, I think for most people it is, like uprooting my life and my partner's life and going to a city to do this thing that, you know, like you hope that maybe you have a book at the end of it, but a lot is truly practically not promised. I think the MFA is 100% what you make it and what you're capable of doing and producing during that time. But ultimately, I made the decision to come back, or you know, they accepted me. You know, I applied and I moved when I got in. And part of the reason I decided to pull the trigger on that was I ultimately, no matter what I knew that having a book deal at the end of it was not a promised thing. But what I needed more than anything at that moment in time was a community of writers who I could gather with and who were all serious about the craft and vulnerable. I just needed that environment. You know, I needed that after kind of creating or like writing on my off time for, you know, I guess half a decade. And it really, for me, it made a huge difference having a cohort, which is also a thing that you can't really predict, but having a group of people and having mentors too there who really, who see what you're doing and who care a lot and who push you and challenge you. That was deeply, like, honestly, it was like that emotional kind of recharge that was most valuable to me. But I did, like, those 2 years. The first year I came in with a novel that I thought was going to be my novel, and then that first year I had conversations with you know, teachers who become my mentors, where I realized, okay, I can maybe do something better. You know, I could do something more true. And that's where this book came from. Really, it was like a conversation I had where I was like, okay, I can write something else. And then writing with, you know, being workshops with, you know, established writers I respect and really admired. That was, I mean, invaluable. It really, I feel like I was, you know, honestly just fortunate that they saw my seriousness in my work and they, you know, both challenged me and lifted me up. You know, I felt I had to be at the top of my game, right, to come in to a workshop with my cohort who I respected, and also these, you know, kind of giants in the field. And I felt really nurtured though I can't, I do want to say practically, it was an enormous expense to uproot and and I was working full time. New York is expensive, and so I was, it was a really beautiful experience for me, but I was dog tired, truly. I really was, and that's part of, I think, probably why Edie came out the way she came out. Because I was also struggling with the demands of living and balancing art. But ultimately, and it was an enormous privilege that I could do it, really. And it's a privilege not everyone can enjoy, for sure. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. For me, it really helped. I just don't think that this book would be in the world, at least as kind of soon as it was, without that.
And that first novel, did it go away, or did you find a way to turn it into something else, or?
I look at it occasionally and I think maybe, because there is a sadness of having written an entire thing and having to put it away. I feel of two minds, which is that writing that thing got me to the place where I could write this thing. And so it's not wasted, but yeah, I do. I occasionally I go in my Google Docs and think maybe, if I just, but I don't know if I'll be able to salvage it, but I still am grateful for it because it did get me to, it was still a novel that kind of sharpened my tools in a way where I could write this.
And it could definitely inspire something else too. Every time you go back into the Google Doc,
right,
maybe.
That's
right. Your past writing always comes in handy somehow. So do you work with a particular audience in mind when you write?
No, not really. When I'm writing, I do not think about. It's interesting. Like I do not think about my audience as I'm writing, but at the same time, on a craft level, I am extremely anxious and sensitive to how to keep a person reading. Like I feel very like it's important to be generous with your readers and to structure your work and be thoughtful about the way it's composed in a way where they won't put it down at page 25, though inevitably I'm sure some people have, but like more than anything, it's more the craft level where I'm thinking about my audience, where I'm trying to write an efficient piece of work. But in terms of like, what will people think and, what will people take from this? It's not even a conscious decision I've made to be that way. I just simply, when I write, I'm really deeply, as deep as I could possibly be inside myself. And it just comes out that way. Though I will say, I wrote this book knowing that I was trying to depict, the life of a Black woman. I wrote it understanding the responsibility that I had in that depiction. Even though it's it's a representation that is one where she's a Black woman who is fallible and who makes mistakes and who is angry and who is not even particularly a moral character. But I still felt more than anything a responsibility in that depiction that allowed her humanity. And in writing it, that was really, I think, the biggest sort of consideration where you don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to be I don't know how to articulate it. You don't want to be kind of callous and thoughtless in the depiction of a consciousness, especially one of a Black woman. Especially, and I have obviously great stake in that. So I did feel in a number of ways responsible to tell a human and honest story. But otherwise, I really I don't know if I were thinking about how people would feel about my work as I was writing it, I think I would honestly be too paralyzed to write.
Well, I think it's unfortunate that while you're writing and creating a character like Edie, you do have to think about who you're representing and what that representation is. you know, because as a writer, do you just feel that, oh, I wish I could just write something and it'll be good, but I don't have to represent someone, or I don't have to be cautious of,
Of course.
yeah.
Of course. And I feel like we all kind of feel that. You know? I think we all do feel that. But I would respect that we live in the world that we do, where art has a great bearing on, you know, on the way we understand ourselves and the way we understand other people, and can be harmful, right? You know, and so and that's a really, really potentially controversial thing to say, you know, but I want to be generous, and I want my work to have been sensitive without kind of deferring to, without trying to defer to the way marginalized writers might be pigeonholed or limited by the idea that there is a specific way to write, you know, X character. You know, I definitely feel that. And I think a lot of, you know, when you get the space, because it's really rare space, to be able to write a character or depict, you know, a person from your community, because it is like, there need to be so many more of us who have that privilege. So you want to honor that, the space that you're taking up with a sensitive depiction, but you also want to write with freedom. You want to be able to, you know, to write something that feels liberating. I think ultimately that is how you honor that rare space.
I'm a visual, when I'm reading, I like to visualize what the characters look like. And, you know, when I was reading Luster, I immediately visualized, you know, what they look like. And it got me thinking, like, have you been approached about a film adaptation? Are you allowed to say anything about that?
I don't know if I'm allowed to say anything about that yet, but I am really curious who you were thinking of, because I'm actually the opposite. I don't have any, like, I really deeply, I feel like in revision, that was one of the things where, you know, my editor was like, what do they look like? And I kind of had to, like, you know, cobble some things together. But I mean, I do now have faces in mind that I really love. But it would be putting you on the spot if I asked you what you thought that.
No, well, for Edie, have you ever heard of the rapper Flo Milli?
Of course. Oh, I love that.
I love her so much.
Great,
As
like, perfect energy too.
Right? Yeah. Like, you would let Flo Milli bully you. Like, if Flo Milli bullied you, you'd be like, I get it. I deserve it.
100%.
And they're about the same age. And then for Eric, I thought of Peter Gallagher.
Oh yeah.
The eyebrows. I was like, that just feels like a nice dad.
Yeah.
Are you working on anything now? Is it too soon to get back into it?
I'm not working on anything now. I'm really mostly just taken up with, like, the book launch. But soon, I'm excited to get back to work.
What has been your favorite part of the whole kind of the book tour, the virtual book tour, I guess?
I mean, it really is just hearing how that kind of impressions that readers have gotten from the book, because I do think that because the way I write feels so deeply subconscious, you know, like that, you know, I don't want to downplay craft in the writing, but it really does feel like something that just comes out of me, that the kind of reflection on it comes very much after the fact. And so in having these conversations with people who've read, it has, I feel like I understand my book in a different way, and that's been really beautiful to kind of see how generous people have been in engaging with the work, and hearing, you know, every now and then I'll wake up and I'll have like a ping, like, well, sometimes the internet is good, you know, but like sometimes I'll wake up to a little, like, kind of note from someone who's just finished the book, and it is like, is deeply surreal and incredible. That I've done that, you know, I've read books and, like, sent off, you know, some fan mail, and because you get excited, you know, and it's kind of cool to feel that, you know, coming my way. That is just the coolest thing.
Do you ever worry? I know some authors worry about looking at reviews. Some authors worry about going on Twitter. Does that scare you, or does it make you apprehensive?
I think 80%, 85% of it has been really good. I don't go on like sort of like the community aggregate reviews, because who knows? I don't think I need to see that, more because I actually feel like you know, I've received like such a beautiful and generous response where people have reached out, where I like that just feels good enough. I'll take that. Of course there has been weird stuff on the internet, of course, because I'm online, I'm an author who's online, and I've thought a lot about that, what that looks like, because I think overwhelmingly now, up until, going forward, authors will be people who are online and who perhaps grew up online. And so people can reach me and people can say really beautiful things to me, but sometimes people can say weird things to you. And that's interesting. But otherwise, I think the response has been really cool. Like, it's been really, really cool. And I don't feel like I have to like shutter all my social media accounts, because mostly it's just been really wonderful and generous kind of feedback and notes that are coming through.
Well, I'm very happy for you for that, because I have also, even people who don't tag you, like sometimes I'll just be on Twitter or Instagram and someone will say something so lovely and I'll be like, wow, I hope she sees that. Like, it's so nice. You said you're not writing anything at the moment. I guess my final question to you is, are you reading something that you're enjoying or watching?
I really, really love Yagyasi's Transcendent Kingdom. I mean, I just think that she's like luminous and incredible. I was rewatching, because now we kind of don't have like much new content coming out. I'm rewatching New Girl, which is just a really beautiful kind of like shot of dopamine, like very kind of pleasant.
I think everyone has experienced a New Girl rewatch at some point in quarantine, and you just need like a little bit of Nick Miller in your life. Yeah,
that's right.
I totally get it. Thank you very much, Raven. Thank you for coming to Ake, and thank you for spending this time with us.
This is really wonderful. Thank you so much.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words. Many scenes like I'm nowhere to be found. If you look, you'll find me in a book. Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book.
We don't just think of ourselves as a bank. We think of ourselves as corporate citizens with responsibility for growing the economy. Reading and education is a key part of it. But equally important is having access to reading materials at home. A lot of the intervention we've done throughout this COVID is to ensure that people can safely navigate the uncertainties of the COVID crisis and come out of it ready for, to live again.
Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
The dreams that we have are limited by what we have directly interacted with. What reading does is it makes it possible for you to begin to live in worlds that don't yet exist. One read creates a discipline of reading. One read puts me on a timeline. It gives me an important book and I have an opportunity to read it and to collaborate. It's almost like having someone who does your book selection for you. If you have editors and people who are really good at this saying to you, this is the book for the month, I value that. I want to be able to read in a community. I want reading to be a collaborative thing. I want reading to be a communing, and One Read allows me to do that. I will use One Read any day, anytime.
I was very excited when I got the call because it's a new frontier. Every chance to create is beautiful, and so to have the opportunity to create a theme song for something I actually care about, it's a perfect combination.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words.
First, create a melody. Melodies are usually what make songs, as they say, sweet, and so that is where I started from. I tried to find something that merged the folk sound I'm used to, but also sprinkle a bit of the African spirit in there.
When it seems like I'm nowhere to be found, if you look, you'll find me in a book.
With the lyrics for the songs, a lot of times when I was younger, when you didn't find me anywhere, I was very likely in my room reading a book.
Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
Reading is a big part of my person, and I'm also a writer, so it all just comes together. The best thing about reading, and what's really important about it, is that it helps us become who we should be. With reading, we become many things. We become empathetic to people. Stories that are not ours, we get to experience, and I feel like that is one thing that makes you a well-rounded human being.
You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book.
It's extremely important to read the work of other African writers that are not Nigerian or from my nationality, because it's a beautiful mix of finding home and visiting a new place, all in one.
Never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book.
One Read is an app I will use.
Stranger's Guide is not a typical American travel magazine. Our mission is to dive deep into a single location, commissioning work from great writers and photographers, famous individuals, as well as up-and-coming new voices. This year, we decided to go to Lagos. And we are proud of the volume we produced, with original work from some of Nigeria's best writers and photographers, working with luminaries like Wale Soyinka, Molara Wood, and Femi Kute. We think this is a very special volume, and we're so excited to bring it back to Lagos.
Don't ruin your special moment. Shop now. Altmont